Let's be honest with each other. I'm sitting in an architect's office, talking into a piece of glass, pretending you're on the other side. Or you're probably in your home watching me on a screen that's, what, yay big? It's like magic. But what makes it work is a David and Goliath story that, frankly, you'll have to see to believe.
Friend Blink.
The Waldorf Astoria Orchestra. Amos and Andy.
Well, now listen, Andy, here we all live, and I leave it to the rest of them. You was wrong, and you know you was wrong. Now what you got to say?
The Grand Ole Opry.
Oh, man, believe, why can't you be true?
After World War I, radio made the Roaring '20s roar.
It was hotter than hot, newer than new. In 1920, very few homes had a radio. By the end of the decade, almost every home had a radio.
Radio was king, and the power behind the throne was the general manager of the Radio Corporation of America, David Sarnoff.
David Sarnoff saw himself as a great leader. He wanted to crush his rivals. He wanted to be the dominant force in radio.
Sarnoff knew the real power was in patents.
It was his job when he was a young executive to police the patents, to make sure that people who were making radios in the very early days would pay a royalty to RCA. And that was his idea.
He thought, what a great idea. I'll just buy all the patents to radio. Anybody who makes any radios will have to buy parts that I own the patents of. I'll get a payday on every single radio made.
7.5% of the revenue of a radio would come to RCA. And that made them a very powerful, very profitable company.
Sarnoff's success seemed guaranteed until an unlikely competitor emerged 2,000 miles away. Rigby, Idaho. The Farnsworth family farm had a few hundred acres, an electric generator, and a 14-year-old whiz kid named Philo.
He's a farm boy, uneducated. He grows up in the Old West. His father drives a stagecoach. They go by covered wagon to this farm in Rigby, Idaho, where his job every day is plowing a field.
He was an exceptionally bright and curious kid. He was reading magazines like Science and Invention and Radio News, and he was inspired to become a great inventor like Edison.
Well, you got to imagine this kid reading these science fiction magazines about how they're going to send pictures through the air.
But it was more than sci-fi. Mechanical TV was becoming a thing.
Once radio transmission existed, people were definitely thinking about being able to transmit pictures as well as sound.
Mechanical television used a rotating disc with holes in it to translate an image into a pattern of electric signals. That code could be sent over radio waves to a neon bulb. As the bulb flickered out the code, another spinning disc would reassemble the image onto a screen. Mechanical television worked, but not well.
With these spinning discs, you couldn't get the pictures quick enough to look like fluid motion.
Farnsworth needed something to scan images much faster than a disc could spin.
He starts thinking about, well, maybe the only thing that should move in a television set should be the electrons.
The electrons move so much faster than the spinning holes, and you could have many, many more pixels.
But how could a farm boy use a beam of electrons to scan an image? He found his answer in a potato field.
He was plowing the field, the potato field, and he looked back and saw the lines, the parallel lines, the furrows in the field, and he got a bolt from the blue.
So his basic theory was, you train an electron to do what the horse does. It goes to the end of the row and it comes back. As it's doing that, it's completing a picture.
This is how television will work. Lines on a screen painted with electrons.
Farnsworth was desperate to vet his idea, but he already knew he had to be careful.
His own father said, Philo, you shouldn't tell anybody this idea. He was really burning to tell this idea to someone who could evaluate it.
He turned to someone he knew he could trust, his high school science teacher, a devout Mormon named Justin Tolman.
He disclosed the idea on a blackboard and also drawing a picture of his original idea of an image dissector, which became the television camera.
Farnsworth's image dissector would break an image into a series of lines like the furrows in a field. Each line would be converted into a sequence of electrons. That code could be sent to a receiver that would reassemble each image line by line.
With the electronic television and moving electrons, it could be so fast that the human mind would see it as perfectly fluid motion.
And Tolman, from what he knew about science, said it just might work.
The grateful student gave his teacher a sketch of his image dissector. It's a good thing he did, too. To take his revolutionary idea from paper to prime time, Farnsworth needed cash.
He would take any odd job that would come along, and one of them was as a chauffeur. There were these two gentlemen, George Everson and Leslie Gorell, and they just really took a liking to this young driver. Farnsworth describes television, and George Everson is a gambler.
The gamblers gave the young inventor the cash to get started. So Philo and his wife, Pem, headed for the West Coast, where their challenges were just beginning.
The whole challenge in television was to turn a picture into an electrical signal.
For this new idea to work, he'd have to rely on old technology.
In the 19th century, there was an invention called the Geissler tube, after a German scientist, Geissler. What he had done was figured out how to blow glass into a tube, a cylindrical tube, and then pump all the air out of it. So it was a vacuum.
And vacuum tubes held incredible potential for television.
Scientists figured out that when they create a voltage gap between one end and the other, they call it the cathode and the anode end of this tube, electricity would flow. Prior to that, electricity could only flow in a closed circuit of wire, and if you broke the wire, the electrical signal just stopped. But what they found is that electrons or electricity could move through a vacuum.
So Farnsworth went looking for the perfect vacuum tube. Unfortunately, the type he needed wasn't available at the local hardware store.
Creating a vacuum tube with flat ends was very difficult, and the bottom line was nobody had ever tried it because there was no reason to.
So Farnsworth hired a glass blower.
It's very hard to make them without them imploding, and it took a lot of broken glass, but they finally figured it out.
Farnsworth had his vacuum tube, but on the inside of that tube, he had another conundrum.
You need a plate coated with a material that will create an electrical impulse when light shines on it.
That was the tricky thing to invent. That was the tricky thing to have the right coating.
Farnsworth chose potassium as his coating, a chemical sensitive enough to spit out electrons when hit with light. But those electrons needed to know where to go.
One of the things you need to do in both the camera and the receiving tube is direct the flow of electrons.
So he surrounded his tube with electromagnetic coils.
What they did is they directed the image, they directed the flow of electrons through the tube. And it was a way of tuning the picture in, if you will.
After years of dreaming and tinkering, Philo finally put it all together.
They set it all up and turned it on, and the thing just smoked and blew up.